What's the most forgotten amendment to the Bill of Rights? In the minds of many scholars, it's the Third Amendment. Take a second and think. Can you name what right is protected by the Third Amendment? You can probably name some or all of the rights protected by the First and Second. They come to mind quickly: freedom of speech, religion, the right to bear arms, and so on. But what about the third? It says, "No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house, without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law." It's probably the most forgotten of any amendment in the Bill of Rights. Not a single case pertaining to the Third Amendment has ever made it to the Supreme Court. However, the issue of quartering soldiers in private homes was a major grievance for the American colonists prior to the Revolution. Opposition to involuntary quartering of troops was closely tied into suspicions against standing armies, which many Americans thought to be a threat to liberty, falling as they did within the Whiggish classical Republican camp of political thinking. This suspicion of standing armies and the problem of involuntary quartering had ancient roots, going back at least 1,000 years. As far back as the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxons had developed a militia system for self-defense, called the Fyrd. The Fyrd consisted of all able-bodied men in a region. The militiamen were required to provide their own weapons and equipment. A legal basis for the militia was established in 1181 when Henry II issued the Assize of Arms. It stated that all freemen were obligated to possess and bear arms for militia service when called upon by the king. This was extended even to serfs in 1253, and distinguished England from the continental feudal system in which only the wealthy few were armed. Early notions of a professional military force first appeared after the Norman conquest in 1066. While the Fyrd would be retained, the overall military situation would change. William the Conqueror introduced a feudal system in which he granted lands to his Norman followers in exchange for rendering military service on his behalf. Norman soldiers were supported by taxing the native Anglo-Saxon population, all while abusing the people and ravaging the countryside. It was this Norman centralization and its abuses that laid the groundwork for English opposition to the involuntary quartering of soldiers. Early attempts to prevent these abuses included two charters to the city of London, one by Henry I in 1130 and another by Henry II in 1155, granting that no one inside the walls of the city could be compelled to quarter anyone. These protections against billeting were later incorporated into the charters of other cities and boroughs. From 1131 to 1208, 22 cities gained legal protections against forcible quartering. In 1215, these rights were solidified with Magna Carta's declaration that, quote, "London shall have all its ancient liberties and free customs. Besides, we will and grant that all other cities, boroughs, and ports shall have all their liberties and free customs." End quote. Protections against quartering soldiers seems to have been a uniquely British phenomenon. A survey of charters for 102 French, 44 German, and 2 Spanish towns, as well as the laws of 37 towns in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, shows that only 4 charters, and all of them French, retained protections against involuntary quartering of troops. Indeed, the earliest of these, given to the city of Rouen circa 1151, seems to be modeled on the London Charter. In the meantime, the tendency to rely on professional soldiers increased. Throughout the Middle Ages, English kings fought many wars at home and abroad, and the traditional militia system could not supply the manpower needed to do so. Both Edward I and Edward II tried to make the men of the Fyrd fight on the European continent. Parliament would try to rein this in as being contrary to the ancient usage of the Fyrd, namely self-defense, and made Edward III pledge that he would not use it for service abroad. Even if the men could be raised for service, the militia was perennially short of arms, training, and lacking in organization. Feudal obligations could not make up the slack either, as these were often limited to only 40 days of service, hardly enough time to wage a war. Consequently, a greater reliance was placed upon mercenaries and indentured soldiers, often being drawn from the dregs of society. In a single year, Edward I pardoned nearly 500 criminals, some of whom were murderers, for service in his army. Citizens complained of abuse from soldiers, including physical beatings, rape, theft, and destruction of property. Naturally, protections against quartering were ignored, and soldiers would often billet within homes, irrespective of the owner's wishes. They were legally required to reimburse the owners with tallies or chits for anything requisitioned, but often these vouchers were completely worthless. The quartering issue would become very prominent during much of the 17th century, right as the American colonies were being founded and settled. The issue was keenly felt during the reign of Charles I. Upon his assumption to the throne, Charles was eager to intervene in the 30 Years' War, and dispatched three disastrous overseas expeditions from 1625 to 1627. For these, Charles pressed about 50,000 men into indentured service, totaling about 1% of the population. Parliament did not want to fund these expeditions, and, wielding the power of the purse, declined to give the money he needed. Still, Charles had an army to house, and lack of funds wouldn't stop him from doing so. His soldiers were forcibly quartered in private homes, and no reimbursement was made to the owners, since there was no money to do so. Complaints were made to Parliament, and in 1628, as part of its struggle for power with Charles, Parliament passed four resolutions called the Petition of Right, which declared certain rights and liberties enjoyed by Englishmen. One of the complaints in the petition was that Charles had sent, quote, great companies of soldiers and mariners into diverse counties of the realm, and the inhabitants against their wills have been compelled to receive them into their houses. End quote. Charles would reluctantly accept the petition, as he desperately needed Parliament to supply him with funds, but the following March he would dissolve Parliament for 11 years, setting the stage for the English Civil War, which lasted from 1642 to 1651. During the war, both Royalist and Roundhead armies would terrorize the population. Parliamentarian Sir Thomas Fairfax said of the Royalists in particular that, quote, they are extremely outrageous in plundering, putting no deference at all between friends and supposed enemies. They have killed of one man's 1,000 sheep, and thrown much of it away that they could not eat. End quote. During the war, the parliamentarians would establish the first standing army in England's history, the New Model Army, whose terms of service included deployment to anywhere within England and the establishment of a professional officer corps. Following their victory, the New Model Army would not be dissolved. Instead, its power was used to prop up Oliver Cromwell's position as Lord Protector of England, as a sort of de facto military dictatorship, which in turn created more popular dislike of standing armies. A short time after the death of Cromwell, the monarchy would be restored, and Charles II would assume the throne. He too would cause indignation by forcible quartering during the Third Anglo-Dutch War of 1672 to 1674. Charles's son, James II, would be removed from the throne, at least in part, for his maintaining and billeting a standing army as well. James was a Catholic, and upon his accession in 1685, a dissident group of Protestants led by the Duke of Monmouth staged a rebellion. To meet the threat, James more than doubled the size of the standing army to about 20,000, once again causing friction with the population required to house these men. Prior to James's reign, Parliament had passed the Anti-Quartering Act of 1679, and his violation of its terms would be one of the justifications used to remove him in 1688 during the so-called Glorious Revolution. The Bill of Rights of 1689, passed the next year, charged him with keeping a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace and quartering soldiers contrary to law. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 would be foundational in the later development of Anglo-American legal thinking. The war experiences of 17th century England showed that the militia was not really an adequate force for large-scale conflict, either at home or abroad, and this is what drove the eventual adoption of standing armies and the concomitant decline of the militia. In its New World colonies, however, the militia remained a viable system, as most of the conflicts there involved irregular warfare against the American Indians, rather than regular war against European-style armies. Additionally, the American colonists were politically aligned with Whigs and classical Republicans, who placed a high value on the citizens' militia as being necessary to the security of a free state. Perhaps unsurprisingly, major problems with quartering arose in the colonies during the 7 Years' War, when large bodies of British troops needed to be sent to America to counter the French threat. In England and in continental Europe, quartering had ceased to be a problem. The scale and complexity of 18th century war meant that quartering soldiers in homes would no longer suffice, and so governments constructed permanent barracks for their armies. In the colonies, however, no barracks had been constructed by the time of the 7 Years' War. There really had been no need for them. Moreover, colonial legislatures were reluctant to appropriate funds for this purpose, given their natural distrust of standing armies. To do so would be an admission that regular British troops could or should be permanently stationed in the colonies. In 1755, General Braddock attempted to force Pennsylvanians to quarter troops, threatening that he would, quote, take care to burden those colonies the most that show the least loyalty to His Majesty. In response, the Assembly passed a bill asserting the rights of the people as Englishmen in this regard. Despite the fact that the Pennsylvania Assembly based the bill on the Mutiny Act of 1689 passed by Parliament, which itself laid out protections against forcible quartering, the Privy Council disallowed the law. Despite the protests of the local governments, perhaps this quartering policy could be justified given the exigency of the situation. The colonies were, after all, in the middle of a war with France and its Indian allies. But what about quartering in peacetime? With all its newly conquered territory, Britain wanted to secure its holdings by permanently stationing troops in the American colonies. A little more than 2 years after the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, Parliament passed the Quartering Act in May of 1765, which stipulated that the colonial assemblies were to pay the cost of housing and food for troops stationed there, and was to include the construction of barracks. In 1766, the New York Assembly refused to comply with the act, and Parliament threatened to suspend the legislature unless it complied, which it eventually did. In 1767, following the passage of the Revenue Act, which taxed paper, glass, tea, etc., Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts declared, quote, it is impressed in the minds of the people that these duties are a prelude to many more, and much heavier, and that a standing army is to enforce obedience, and the legislative power of the colonies to be taken away. This was indeed the case. In October of 1768, troops were deployed to Boston due to the fact that the legislature of Massachusetts, the General Court, had been dissolved earlier in the year for publishing a circular letter protesting the Townshend Acts, which had imposed new taxes after the repeal of the Stamp Act. On October 1, 2 regiments of redcoats were offloaded from their transport ships and made their way through Boston with great pomp and circumstance, signaling the beginning of the town's year-and-a-half-long occupation. At the time, Boston's population numbered around 15,500, with no more than 4,000 of them being males over the age of 16. Some time later, the total force would amount to 4 regiments and 2 companies of a fifth, an artillery detachment, ship crews, wives, children, and other civilian attendants. This was no minor presence. Around 1 in 3 men in the city was a British soldier. Many of these soldiers came from very poor backgrounds, and picked army life as the lesser of two evils. Still, the pay was bad and life in the British Army was tough. To supplement their meager income, many soldiers took on part-time work. A massive glut in the Boston labor market, and the willingness of the soldiers to work at less than the market rate, had the effect of depressing wages and taking jobs from the Bostonians. As can be expected, the presence of the army also led to an increase in rapes, assaults, and theft. Additionally, the added presence of the Royal Navy meant that Boston sailors were in danger of impressment into Royal Navy service, which, needless to say, was a cause of great resentment. The soldiers considered Boston a garrison town, and this, perhaps more than anything else, irritated the people. They were now subject to challenge by sentries, simply as they walked down the street. Many refused to answer, and sometimes were given the butt of a rifle for their insolence. The men of Boston were accustomed to personal liberty under civil rule, and the discontent they felt at military rule would eventually boil over. In March of 1770, a mob attack on 9 British soldiers led to the event known as the Boston Massacre. A few days later, With the city about to explode from the pressure, Governor Thomas Hutchinson reluctantly ordered the troops out of the town to be housed at Castle William in the harbor, thereby ending the occupation. During the occupation of Boston, an anonymous publication called the Journal of Occurrences, perhaps authored by Samuel Adams, had been circulated to the other colonies and reprinted. It claimed to record factually accurate accounts of the military occupation of Boston, with its attendant horrors and abuses. British officials claimed it was nothing more than deceitful propaganda, full of lies and misrepresentations. In either case, the journal's articles were widely circulated and inspired sympathy for the plight of the Bostonians in the other colonies, further hardening American attitudes towards Britain. In 1774, Parliament would pass another quartering act, this time allowing governors to house troops in private homes if other lodging were not available. This act would become known as one of the Intolerable Acts, the response to which would include the meeting of the First Continental Congress. When Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence, two of the grievances which he listed charged George III with keeping, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures, and quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. Shortly after declaring their independence, the new states began devising their own forms of government and adopting bills of rights. 8 adopted statements warning against the dangers of standing armies, and 4 included separate statements on involuntary quartering. Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Virginia, and Vermont all stated that standing armies in the time of peace are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be kept up. Maryland, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire added to that the clause, without the consent of the legislature. In contrast, the militia was viewed as more fitting for a free republic. For example, Virginia's 1776 Bill of Rights said, quote, "A well-regulated militia, composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state." Nevertheless, the reality of the 18th century military situation was unavoidable to Americans in the same way that it had been to the English in the 17th. Although in England and America the classical Republican tradition held the militia in high esteem, its efficacy on the battlefield left much to be desired. George Washington complained of the militia that they, quote, "come in you cannot tell how, go you cannot tell when, and act you cannot tell where, consume your provisions, exhaust your stores, and leave you at last at a critical moment." End quote. Having fought Britain for 8 long years, it was difficult to maintain that a citizen's militia could meet the demands of modern war. Accordingly, in 1787, during the debates over the Constitution, the power of raising and supporting armies was expressly given to Congress in the proposed Constitution. Though in the minds of the Anti-Federalists the quartering issue was inextricably linked to the existence of standing armies, the Federalists felt that the two could be disentangled. Following the ratification of the Constitution, the task of crafting a Bill of Rights fell upon James Madison, a Federalist. To get the margins needed for its adoption by the states, Madison had to find a unifying position. Accordingly, his draft of what would become the Third Amendment touches only upon the quartering issue, leaving the maintenance of a standing army to be decided politically. The text of the amendment reads, "No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law." In his commentaries on the Constitution of the United States, Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story said that the Third Amendment's, quote, "plain objective is to secure the perfect enjoyment of that great right of common law, that a man's house shall be his own castle, privileged against all civil and military intrusion." End quote. Since its adoption, the Third Amendment has had very few court cases, and little scholarship exists on it, leading some to dismiss it as merely a relic of former times. So, what do you think? Is the Third Amendment forgotten because it's outdated, a product of antiquated social conditions? Or is it forgotten simply because it's been successful and uncontroversial? Either way, hopefully you've now got a greater appreciation for the history and principles behind the Constitution's most forgotten amendment. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and support me on Patreon. Thanks.